What kind of economic systems are best at allowing us to exercise the fact that we are created in the image and likeness of God?
Now keep in mind that if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you're going to reach it.
Scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics.
If you don't provide real, actual value to people in exchange for the money that you're asking for in return, you will lose over time.
We can see the economy as a social web that God has created for people to serve each other with their work.
We have the Word of God that provides for us a foundation for knowledge, for truth, for beauty, for goodness, for dignity and value in human beings. We have the Word of God that provides for us things like this. Ready? Thou shalt not steal.
Ethics on the legitimacy of wealth and entrepreneurship individually. Secondly, post-millennial eschatology. That is, the kingdom of God expands across the earth before Jesus comes back in final judgment. And the link to get those two together is the idea of the pursuit of self-interest leading to widespread economic growth and social transformation.
We are a nation of people that no longer speak to each other. We are a nation of people who have stopped being friends with people because of who they voted for in the last election. We are a nation of people who have isolated ourselves to only watch channels that tell us that we're right.
My message here today is that tribalism is ruining us. It is tearing our country apart. It is no way for sane adults to act.
If everyone's entitled to their own facts, there's really no need for compromise, no need for people to come together. In fact, there's really no need for people to interact. We need to have some shared understanding of reality. Otherwise, we aren't a country.
So long-term, the solution here is to build more AI tools that find patterns of people using the services that no real person would do.
We are allowing the technologists to frame this as a problem that they are equipped to solve. That's a lie. People talk about AI as if it will know truth. AI is not going to solve these problems. AI cannot solve the problem of fake news. Google doesn't have the option of saying, oh, is this conspiracy? Is this truth? Because they don't know what truth is. They don't have a proxy for truth that's better than a click.
If we don't agree on what is true, or that there is such a thing as truth, we're toast. This is the problem beneath other problems, because if we can't agree on what's true, then we can't navigate out of any of our problems.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and Nathan Johnson is with me again today. This episode it has the potential to go in a lot of different directions. So let's try to cram in as much as we can in, 20 minutes. Nathan, you think we can do it?
I think we can try.
Yeah, we can definitely try. That's all I can say. So Nathan and I just watched a documentary on Netflix called, what is it called? The Social Dilemma. And yes, we watched it on Netflix. Marcus Pittman.
There's a dilemma right there.
What?
There's a dilemma right there.
Yeah, no, Marcus Pittman needs to hurry up with lore so we can get that thing going. But anyways, what was this? So what was it about? Nathan, can you give us just a high-level overview? What was this documentary about? And we can dive into the details.
Yeah, so high level, basically, it's a bunch of guys from Silicon Valley, Twitter, Facebook, Google, who have quit. And most of them for ethical reasons, as they've seen the effect that the algorithms and the AI of these social media platforms have, what they've done to people. They've become very concerned. And so basically they're just kind of being interviewed and giving us, the people who consume this stuff, kind of a behind the curtain look at why is it that certain things pop up in my news feed? Why is it that I can easily go down these rabbit holes? Why is it that I feel so isolated and alone when I'm, even if I have 10,000 followers on Twitter? It goes in a lot of different directions, but it's basically trying to show how does marketing, advertising, and the algorithms behind these programs, how does that affect our social experience?
Yeah, and it even goes in. It goes into like the biological effects that these social media platforms have on us that we don't really we don't know, or we just don't perceive right off the bat. That's the one thing I wanted to hit right off the bat because I don't know if how detailed or how much we're going to go into this, but just the idea that, well, first as a just to preface this documentary assumes an evolutionary biological materialistic worldview, and so I just want to say that right off the bat. So when they talk about these social media platforms and how they manipulate us, they're basically saying, you know, certain like buttons and the certain things that are fed to you trigger dopamine and trigger the synapses in your brain, and they give you kind of this high and this they essentially can make you addicted. And so they're talking about how much power these organizations have because they can affect your essentially your biology, and they can make you do things. I think one of the quotes that the guy had, he said they were talking about the power that these organizations have and what they're after. And the first part of the documentary was about how their business model is about getting eyeballs, getting attention. Right. That's the thing they do. But the one guy followed it up and said, he said, it's not just attention. It's the slight, gradual, imperceptible changes in human behavior that that social media organizations are after. And they do this, they can manipulate you by harvesting all of this data about you. And they even went into like some of the things that they know about you that maybe you don't even know. And they get it by like how much, when you're scrolling through your feed, how much time do you spend looking at something? What things do you stop scrolling on, and how long do you stop scrolling on them? What things, like it gives kind of the picture of what triggers in your brain, what things attract you, what things do you want to see, right? Which is kind of scary if you think about it. It's almost like this middle ground between our biology and technology. It's just this weird like interplay between the two. Yeah, and it kind of made me a little nervous as I'm watching this. I'm like, man, how much? And I start looking at how I operate in social media. I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, I need to be more careful. And more, I guess, intentional about how I use this stuff.
Yeah, essentially what it's doing, and I mean, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Is it's curating for each individual the reality that it thinks that individual wants.
Yes.
So it would be like, you know, if you're a super wealthy person and you've hired an art curator to put up artwork all throughout your house. So that art curator is going to first ask you a bunch of questions to get to know you and your preferences and what you like and what emotions are triggered by certain things. And then that curator is going to go off and going to find the art that really fits you.
Ooh, I like this analogy.
It's like that, but for everybody, and it's done by AI.
Yeah. Well, yeah, some by that, and some by people deciding. Like, I think there are individual instances where human actors are deciding. Like, for instance, right now we have the whole like Hunter Biden stuff, and there's people who are deciding what things can get pushed out and what things can't. Like, but yeah, largely I think it's algorithmic. But even behind the algorithm, it's still human assumptions behind algorithms. I think the lady in there, mentioned that all algorithms are programmed to a specific definition of success, right? So the programmer has to decide what success looks like for the algorithm to work, and that's subjective. That's not objective. That's like super subjective.
Right.
Yeah, but I like that. I like the art curator analogy. That's good. I might have to use that.
Yeah, well, and I think it helps us realize, obviously, the possibilities, but also the dangers of this, because it's one thing if you want to curate your house with art. It's another thing if you want to curate your life. If you want to curate the kinds of news that you get, or if you want to curate the kinds of people that you interact with, it's a kind of control. It's unconscious control, because you're not the one choosing how to curate your life. It's Facebook, or it's the Google News platform, or whatever. But it's basically a life that is designed specifically for you. And one of those clips that you played at the beginning was about how relationship and kind of societal unity is based on shared experience or shared reality.
Yep.
But if everybody has a unique experience, a unique reality, and there is very little shared experiences, what you get instead is division and tribalism.
Yep.
It's the echo chambers that we talk about. It's the bubbles.
We talked about that in the episode where we talked about intersectionality and how, like, if you can't share any experience at all, then no one can relate to each other.
Right.
It's the same kind of thing. But yeah, and I think in the grand scheme, this ultimately falls down on like the concept of truth, right? We had like reality, truth. What is truth? Because these, like you're saying, these tools, or these social media tools, are pushing to us things that it thinks that we like or we want to see, and that kind of capitalizes on fake news, quote unquote, or just kind of skewed news. And so we all have these different realities, and then we can't understand each other when we try to talk to each other, because we're like, how can you be so dumb? Like, how can you be so stupid? Yeah. Haven't you seen blah 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 blah? But it ultimately comes down, I think it's a theological thing, because how do we decide what's true? I mean,
yeah,
you've got to. We've destroyed the mechanism that we've had for deciding what's true, because now all this. I may be getting ahead of myself, but the pervasiveness of these social media platforms, and even the news media platforms, that's pretty much 95% of the way we get our news and our information, right? And so if everyone has their own take on what is actually true, we're like the guy said, we're toast. We're gone.
Yeah.
And it's scary in my opinion. I'm not scared like nihilistic, like,
right.
I'm not hopeless, but that's a scary thing to think about.
Yeah, I've seen this in a couple different avenues. So in my Google News feed, I'm becoming more and more dissatisfied with it, because it learns pretty quickly what kind of articles I've been clicking on.
Yep.
And then it just gives me articles like that. But it doesn't account for the fact that maybe one week I'm really interested in reading some articles about tennis and some articles about, what's happening in the Senate. But that's not all that I'm interested in. And so why is it now that whenever I go to Google News every morning to see the news, I'm getting a very slim selected content? And it's frustrating, because I think everybody thought that by putting all the news online, that's going to enable people to get more variety of their news. So they're not going to be tethered to like one newspaper.
Yeah.
Right. You can have access to any newspaper, any source of news all around the world. You can basically the idea being that you can actually have more access to truth because you can have a variety of sources. But for 90% of us, we rely on Google News or Apple News or one of those news platforms to give us the news, to give us the headlines.
Or push notification to us about articles that we should read.
Exactly. Right.
USA Today is the worst. And anyways, that's a side note, but go ahead.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we're basically kind of in the same boat, except it's a little bit worse than just the newspaper that we used to get at our doorstep, because this is news curated to specific things that could be hobby horses. It could be the same things that fuel our outrage every time. It could be things that are really clickbaity, those clickbait titles that the article itself doesn't actually reflect the title, but it gets you to click on it.
Right.
So it's the extreme articles, or it's the misleading ones, or it's the ones that kind of fuel our soapboxes that we keep clicking on. And it's the same thing with Facebook. I've gotten so frustrated with Facebook recently because I'll scroll. I have, 1,200 friends on Facebook, and yet why is it that when I'm scrolling through my newsfeed on Facebook that I'm getting the same 12 people over and over again? Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and it's like, wait, what's going on? It's like, oh, well, it's because I had a pattern of, pausing on those people or liking what they've said or reading an article that they've posted, and suddenly
a pattern
I don't have access.
A pattern that you may not even weren't even aware of, but it picked it
up. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now I don't have access to 1,000 of my friends.
Right.
So that's just limiting our ability to get information. And as the documentary was talking about, fake news or inflammatory news, gets like 6 times more clicks.
Yep.
And this is well, I was just going to say real quick, this is where advertising comes in.
Yes. Yep. Go ahead. Is that, I want to jump in with something, but I want to make sure you're done with your thought first.
I was just going to say that we've got to, when approaching this discussion, we've got to throw in the money advertising marketplace component.
Yes. And I think that's a perfect segue, because I don't know if you were able to listen to, but a couple months ago I had on Matt Rothbard, who is, or not, his last name's not Rothbard. Sorry. That's his social media name, but Matt Erickson. He's the host of Wealth, Power, and Influence with Jason Stapleton. And we were talking about media bias. And he brought up this good point about the incentives that these organizations have. And there's 2 big influences. They have a financial incentive and they have a political incentive, right? Neither of which necessarily have to be tied to truth. They don't have to have a correspondence to truth, right? They can just be, swayed a certain way, or you can push out a whole bunch of these, like you're saying, fake or inflammatory news because it gives me more clicks. And so that gets us into, okay, let's talk about the business model, and the business model and the financial aspects of it, and I guess the economic discussion about this. At the end of the documentary, they went into this, like, it was kind of a veiled tirade against capitalism, and they didn't say it that way, but you can tell that what they're pushing for is more governmental control over these organizations.
Yep.
And before you kind of give your thoughts on that, I just want to say, look, every economist thinks about the economy and business in terms of, first, supply and demand, but second, in incentives and the risk and reward structure, right? You don't think about the immediate solution to problems. You think about the trade-offs and what incentives certain decisions have on the marketplace. So these people want to they think that the private industry, since it has caused this problem where these organizations are capitalizing on exploiting people's weaknesses, psychological weaknesses, mental health weaknesses, all of that, we should push it over into the public realm and have that be more control over this. And to some extent, I'm like, okay, I understand. Like, one of the guys made a good point. He was like, what if we just put something in line where we say, look, organizations, you can't collect everything. Put a financial incentive or disincentive to collect all the data under the sun, to tie it to the last episode. Which I mean, let me think about that. I think that might interesting thought. I'll entertain that. But I think it's a faulty line of reasoning to think that the incentives that drive the private sector are disregarded when you go over into the public realm. Everyone in this private industry, in the tech industry, wants wealth or some sort of like influence or power or respect. They want gain of some sort, right? They want to increase. Politicians do as well, right? They have those same exact incentives. They're humans. They're human beings. And the playing field that the politicians operate on makes it so much harder for change to happen, in my opinion. Because once they're in office, they're locked in for 2 years, 4 years, whatever. Over here on the private side, though, yes, these organizations have such a big influence on the marketplace that they can make it harder for competition to get in and things like that. But there's more of a direct correlation between the marketplace's distrust and distaste, I guess, for these organizations and their financial downfall, right? So there's two, the risk and reward structure of these two organizations, or these two kind of ways of thinking about moderating and regulating these entities, are operating under the same incentives. It's the same. So I think they made a logical. They didn't think as well through it as they should. But yeah, that's just a little thought that I had about that. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. That you've got to think about the incentives that the government has as well. And the government's a big market player nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. And just before you start, all these organizations, and we heard a clip of Mark Zuckerberg offering the solution to some of this. And I always think it's really funny how Congress, a lot of times when they approach situations like this, where there's an issue of this sort where they don't know how to tackle it, they'll reach out to the key players in that industry to ask them to help Congress write laws to govern the marketplace. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
Right.
Like the Congress goes to Mark Zuckerberg and they're like, "Can you help us write laws to regulate this?" and blah blah blah. And Mark Zuckerberg's like, "Of course I can. Yes, exactly. Of course I will."
Right.
It's the same thing that happened with. Did you hear about big tobacco? Whenever the vape industry started coming up,
no,
the tobacco industry lobbied really hard to get all of these taxes imposed on the tobacco industry, and they lobbied in such a way that they would have the vaping industry lumped into the same categorization as the tobacco industry. And so they've got these massive taxes that they have to pay, and these big tobacco companies they can pay them, but the vape companies can't. So they essentially can put them out of business. It's like a way of using the government to get, a upper hand in the market.
Right.
But anyways.
Well, right. No, and I think that's actually a good example of, in one way or another, whenever you invite government regulation, you're also inviting government subsidy. And subsidizing might come through actually the government giving money, or it might come through lobbyists convincing the government to write tax law in a certain way that's actually going to benefit the thing that the government's trying to regulate. It always happens. Mm-hmm. Always happens. You can see that even with farming, these big what are they called? Corporate farms, or I think that's the word. But these massive farms that are putting small farmers out of business. So the government has all these regulations, but then the government also gives lots of subsidies to farmers. And it's something like 80 or 90% of the money that the government gives to farming goes to the big corporate farmers. So the government's attempt to regulate corporate farming, with one hand, they also end up helping the corporate farms with the other hand. And this it always happens that way because there's actually not as much of a break between government and business as people think. It's not like the government is against business and business is against the government. It's that when the government gets involved in business, business gets the government to help it in some way. And so you actually have government-sponsored monopolies all over the place. So anyway, that's a side note. But
it's a good side note.
In terms of solutions to these problems, and I think the problems that the documentary unfolded were twofold. There was the personal problems with social media, and that was the effect it has on relationships, the effect it has on mental health, you living in your own world, that kind of side. And then you've got the kind of broader societal effects of like fake news and radicalization and all this sort of stuff. And I think when you're looking at the first part with kind of personal issues that come up with social media and the algorithms that are designed for this, it's the same thing with junk food, right? Like there have been people who've been trying to lobby to get the government to limit access to junk food because it's bad for people's health. It's like, yeah, it is bad for people's health. And they have a personal choice to eat that. And it's one thing for the government to require everything to have nutrition facts and tell you what ingredients are in it. It's like, cool, okay. That enables people to be aware of what they're putting in their body. That's great.
Yeah.
The same thing with these problems. It's kind of like junk food. It's really bad for your soul. It makes you depressed. It fractures relationships. Well, the important thing is for you to know that. And then if you want to make that choice anyway to do what's bad for you, that's part of what it means to be an adult, right?
Yeah.
Now, as far as the fake news stuff goes, I'm not in favor of this. Well, the government needs to regulate what's shared on social media or what can be accessed through Google. There needs to be, at least in one sense, if it's government censorship, then we're in bad territory.
Yeah, it's a whole other animal.
Right. But the problem is right now the government isn't trying to censor those things. But what we do find happening, especially in 2020, is that these platforms are censoring things. So they have their own censorship teams that have, New York Post comes out with the Hunter Biden stuff, and then boom, it gets taken down from Twitter. It gets taken down from Facebook. You can't find it. You can't access it through Google.
Yeah.
Just crazy. Actually, you could type in, Hunter Biden emails into Google, and then you could type in the same thing into Bing, and Bing shows you all these New York Post articles. Google shows you all these articles that are against, or debunking the New York Post article.
Yeah.
But you can't find the New York Post articles, right?
Yeah.
Especially on the front page, at least. And so that's the other side where it's, okay, well, now we just have the businesses or corporations doing their own form of censorship. But that's not a good solution to the problem either, because I don't trust the government to censor speech, but I don't trust rando person in an office in Silicon Valley doing that too, choosing what he wants the American public to be able to read or not. Right.
This is why I was talking about how it all comes down to what is true, right? It's a theological thing. It's almost like, and I hesitate to use the analogy or make the connection, but in the garden, Satan said, "Did God not say?" We decided to not trust the knower of truth, the truth itself, right? We decided, hey, let me do it my way. I know it's kind of like a weird analogy, but then you get to Pilate, and Pilate has this weird statement where he's talking about what is truth. You know, like when he hands Jesus over to the crowds, he wrings his hands and says, "What is truth?" And Jesus calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. And so, like what you're saying, yeah, it sucks that these. Maybe I shouldn't use the word sucks, but anyways, the private entities are censoring information. Government has a tendency to censor information, and I think the government has a worse track record of censoring information in history. We talked about Pravda. Remember Pravda from Stalin, his newspaper?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And even in the documentary, they talked about. Did you get that little piece about Myanmar? If you don't remember, basically in Myanmar,
oh yes,
they were talking about how, like, if you get a phone in Myanmar, you have to go through this process where they load Facebook onto your phone first, right? And they get to decide. The government has control over what gets pushed to you, and this resulted in the mass extermination or a mass exodus of Muslims in the country because the government decided that they could use that as a tool for social transformation, which is I'm more scared of that than I am of giving the reins to the private individual to censor what they want. Like Jack Dorsey was on Capitol Hill this week testifying, and his testimony, his little spiel was terrible, but I agreed with a lot of what he said. Like, I agreed. He said basically, Ted Cruz was like, do you think that Twitter influences elections? And Jack Dorsey's like, no. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Of course I do. But he made a statement after that. He said, we're just one in a of multiple organizations that you can get your information from. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense on the ground level. But I think the overarching thing is you can't. Who do we trust?
Yeah.
Who do we trust? And I think ultimately the solution has to be a culture that is dedicated and committed to truth above everything else. And that is a theological thing. You can't, that's ultimately the solution. Because you're dealing with human beings in every turn.
Right.
And there's going to be problems at every turn unless you're committed to truth and knowing truth.
Yeah, and unfortunately, when you're dealing with broader society, truth takes a backseat to money and power, right?
And emotion.
And so the incentives for businesses or the government are primarily going to be money and power, and truth is way down the list, especially if there's not as much money in the truth, right?
Right.
Like, imagine a newspaper that reported things equally. So, I mean, this would be weird because most things in life are not newsworthy, right? They're just like normal. So you report the things that are abnormal. But if everybody's reading about all the abnormal stuff, they start to think that the abnormal things are normal. So it's like,
good point.
Okay, we've got, say, 20 police shootings happen in a 6-month span. But you hear about every single one of them.
Because it gets the money.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you feel like
yes.
Not only is it happening, 20 times through in a population of 330 million people in a massive country, that's like thousands of square miles. But also it makes you feel like instead that it's happening every day right next door.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's the it's like the message that what you decide, what these news organizations and social media organizations decide to spotlight, will cultivate it can cultivate a message that is inconsistent with what is actually true.
Right.
And this like you're talking about with the whatever horrific incidents happen with like police officers or something like that. You can start to think that that's normal. And the statistics don't, that's just not true. It's not true that that's normal.
Yeah. So my thought is that beyond kind of the theological perspective of fundamentally, we need people who are more more committed to truth than they are to power and money. If you think about in terms of laws or what restrictions we can put on the marketplace, I'm becoming more and more in favor of the government getting involved to the extent that they treat these platforms as publishers. And what the benefit I think that would happen from that is, okay, so suddenly Facebook, Twitter become kind of liable for what is published on their platforms. Well, then now they have to actually have a large team of people who are committed to screening what's published on their platforms. Okay, sounds like censorship, but the reality is a lot of people then will look elsewhere for a non-publisher platform to do their social media stuff. And that actually frees the marketplace up for a lot of new things to come up that are strict platforms. What you've done is you've restricted the power of Facebook and Twitter to be this quasi-publisher, quasi-platform that dominates the market.
Yeah.
And there's
and
no
picks
other
and
good
chooses
alternative.
what it is in different circumstances.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Instead, you box it in and you said, okay, fine, you're boxed in as a publisher. Now what's going to happen? Well, now the marketplace opens up because now we do need some more platforms where people can just put their photos, state their political views, throw out whatever article they want. And now you get a lot of alternatives. So there, I think, is a fair way for the government to not start controlling what these social media platforms do, but instead take away some of the financial incentives for them to straddle both sides as publisher and platform.
Yep.
But yeah, I think on a broader level, you're right that in the end, this comes down to individual choices, right? And I liked at the very, very end of the documentary, unfortunately, it was during the credits, so that was kind of lame.
No, I thought that the credits had some of the best parts, or the best pieces, little nuggets or pieces of advice.
Yeah, it did, because it got to the personal and it said, okay, well, what do you do? Well, first it was, giving suggestions about don't let your kids have all of this access to technology until they're, past adolescence.
Oh,
so,
yeah. Have you read that was Jonathan Haidt in the movie?
Yeah.
Did you see that? Have you read Coddling of the American Mind?
I have. Excellent book.
Yeah, it is. The stuff about the teenage girls and what social media does, that is terrifying. That's horrendous. Anyways.
Yeah. And so that kind of deals with the first problem that we were talking about, the personal influence of all this technology, is that you shield kids from it like you would shield kids from a lot of things until they can become fully aware of what they're choosing to do, because they're just not when they're in middle school.
Right.
But then as far as...
And when you bake in the whole idea that it's manipulating people biologically, that even makes it even more sketchy territory when you're pushing it on kids. That it's like, man, what is this doing to their psychology, to their biology? Like, if you're getting dopamine hits every time you post something on Instagram, what is that? Like, what parallels does it have with addiction? Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And then the personal choices as far as news and information, you just got to be aware that what you're going to get from Google News curated for you, or what you're going to get from what's shared on your social media feeds, you got to take that, you got to temper that.
Yeah.
You got to make sure that you don't think that that's reflective of the whole of reality. And maybe you got to do a lot more work to find news sites for yourself that give you multiple perspectives on things.
Yeah.
And then you have to just be diligent in checking in with those or listening to a variety of podcasts or stuff like that, and not leaving it up to your social media feed and Google News to tell you what the news is.
Yep. Yes. I think that's perfect. That's especially as we're going into an election, which by the time people listen to this, we may have already know who the president is. But anyways, just like you're saying, do the extra work and try to, when someone disagrees with you, just realize that everything in their social media, everything that's being pushed to them from these mainstream media organizations, it's that, they're the artists curating for their world, the art for their world. To use your analogy, Nathan, just understand that and yes, pursue what's true and try to get to the bottom of what's actually true. But be humble and think, you could possibly be wrong. You very well could be wrong. No matter how many times people push it to you, or how many times these organizations push the story to you, or the facts, or the alternative facts, or whatever. Just be humble. Be persistent to understand what's true. I think one of the things that these organizations do is they exploit your confirmation bias. We all love to know that we're right.
Right.
But fight against that. Fight against it. Pride is part of the thing that resulted in the fall. So keep that in mind. I also thought it was a really good piece of advice. They said, or it wasn't advice, it was just a nugget of information. The guy at the end in the credits, he was like, just realize that no one in Silicon Valley gives their kids social media. They're not allowed to. If that's not something that that should motivate you or inform your decisions, then I don't know what is. So just think about that.
Yeah, so good.
Awesome. All right, everybody, go like and subscribe to the podcast. Click the notification bell on YouTube. YouTube is the place to go. Do it. Share it. Share it with a friend. This episode, I think, in particular, is going to be really relevant in the coming days because we're so tribalistic in our society and we're coming up into an election. And so, just be persistent. Be committed to truth. Love God. Love neighbor. And build something. Talk to you guys later.